Okay, so to continue with our discussion, so we have today we're going to discuss the population responses to changing conditions over time. So one of which is what we call evolution, and a second one would actually be succession. Okay, succession. So we'll later tackle succession in this particular discussion. Okay, first we have evolution. So by the end of this chapter, you should be able to define evolution and explain the four conditions necessary for evolution by natural selection to occur, and describe the various types of evidence that supports evolution. Okay, so to start with, the concept of evolution dates back to the time of Aristotle, but Charles Darwin, this is Charles Darwin, a 19th century naturalist, proposed the mechanism of evolution that today's scientific community still accept. That is why it is called the theory of evolution. It is a generally accepted fact, and it is described as the cumulative genetic changes in populations that occur during successive generations, or the change over time. Okay, to simply put it. Okay, so it occurred to Darwin that in a population, inherited traits favorable to survival in a given environment tended to become preserved over successive generations, whereas unfavorable traits were eliminated. Okay, so the result is adaptation. For example, you have katong for example, if you have a tree here, then you have beetles, mga bilog din sa mga beetles. So nakay black or dark colored beetles, and then nakay white colored beetles. And by the way, the color of the bark is, let's say, light na siya, and then dark kani siya. Dark. So meaning, kung light ang kung light ang bark or ang color sa tree, ang bark sa tree, tapos darker ang beetles, easy lang kayo siya makita sa predator. For example, if you have a bird predator, that's a bird na lang daw na siya. Okay? Ang una niya makita, katong contrasting kayong beetle. So, ang makaon yun na through predation are these two. Okay? Mas taas ang ilang likelihood or probability ng makaon kaysa aning beetle nga light ang color, which enables it to blend sa color sa environment niya. So, unsay may tabo, siyempre kani mga matay naman ni sila, so dili na sila ka-produce of offsprings, malamang. Okay, so maka-produce of offsprings kay kaning puti nga beetle na lang. So later manganak na siya, mas daga na ang white na beetle, tapos napagyapon sa black, it's the same species man. So these are genetic traits that can be passed down to next generation. So, next generation of trees or beetles, so makaon na po ning black. So, later, manganak na po ni siya, there will come a time na puro na ni sila puti. Okay? So, that's basically adaptation through predation ang iyang pressure. Okay? So, this particular beetle adapted to being eaten by a particular predator. Okay, so adaptation is an evolutionary modification that improves the chance of survival and reproductive success of a species in a given environment. So this is our example. So eventually, the accumulation of many adaptive modifications might result in a new species. So later, for example, dili lang kay ang color niya or ang structure pud ani nga beetle kay maglahi na jud from its original ancestors, then there's a tendency for the future generations, for example, moabot pa siya diri pila ka years or generations ang ulabay, makaproduce siya og bag-o nga species or speciation ang ginatawag ana. So from its original na ancestor kay tungod ato nga adaptation. Okay, totally lahi na siya sa parent generation. Okay, so Darwin proposed the theory of evolution by natural selection in his monumental book, The Origin of Species, by means of natural selection. So since that time, scientists have accumulated an enormous body of observations and experiments that supports Darwin's theory. So although biologists still do not agree completely on some aspects of the evolutionary process, the concept that evolution by natural selection has taken place and is still occurring is now well documented. Okay? So, siya gid ang nag-pioneer sa concept nga the organisms that you see now, uh, are different from the original or the ancestors that we have. Okay, so ana siya because of the adaptation through natural selection. Okay, so natural selection is the tendency of better adapted individuals, those which with a combination of genetic traits best suited to environmental conditions, to survive and reproduce, increasing their proportion in the population. So kato na siya akong giingon ganina. Okay? So as favorable traits increase in frequency in successive generation and as unfavorable traits decrease or disappear, the collection of characteristics of a given population changes. Natural selection is the process by which successful traits are passed on to the next generation and unsuccessful ones are weeded out. Okay, so if you want your future apo to have matangos ang ilong, so karon pa lang mamili na mo og mga partners ninyo nga tangos og ilong. Okay? So eventually ingnon ninyo ang inyong anak, for example ni tangos na pud ang ilong, nak pangita og partner nga tangos pud og ilong para inyong apo puhon kay tangos og ilong until such time nga ma-delete na ninyo ang mga lisngag og ilong. Okay, ang mga flat nose. Okay, no offense sa mga flat nose. Flat nose pud ko sa paraw. Flat nose pud ka. Anyways, so it consists of 4 phenomena that occur in the natural world which can be considered conditions necessary for natural selection. So natural selection has its set of requirements in order for it to occur. So one would be high reproductive capacity. So each species produces more offspring than will survive to maturity, and natural populations have the reproductive potential to increase their numbers continuously over time. Okay, so in order for natural selection to occur, dapat paspas ang or taas ang reproductive capacity of a particular species to produce more offsprings. Okay? So, the more chances na manganak ka with those traits that you selected or that you want, the more ang probability nga katong mga anak nga naka-inherit ato nga genes kay ma-pass on sa ilang mga anak in the future. Okay? So kung gusto ko agtangos sa ilong, mas padagan gyud ka og mga anak padili man sa tao. For wild animals, if they want this particular gene, if they knew how to select these genes, then what they will do is, naturally speaking, will have increased capacity of birth. Okay? Para mas taas ang probability nga ma-pass on gyud tong selected trait. Okay? So second is the limits on population growth or a struggle for existence. So only so much food, water, light, growing space, and so on are available to a population, and organisms compete with one another for the limited resources available to them. Because there are more individuals than the environment can support, not all organisms or offsprings will survive to reproductive age, including many of the fish yet to hatch in sa yung figure 6.17. So this is a limiting factor. So population growth and basically imuhang resources. So not all, for example kanisha, a jawfish incubates eggs in its mouth. If all offsprings of a jawfish pair survive, in turn reproduced, reefs would be shocked with or choked with jawfish. Yet this fish species has not overrun the ocean because these individuals must avoid predation and compete for limited resources. So meaning, sa tanan eggs nga nasa iyang baba karon, not all of the eggs here will actually survive because of different factors sa iyang environment, including predation and possibly the availability of food in that environment as well. Okay, so that would still be determined. Okay, mo na siya, most likely this particular organism evolved from producing a small quantity of eggs to this particular to its present quantity nga daghan kay siya. Okay, kay sa una mas effective kung kinsa tong daghan og offspring. Okay, possibly using the evolution concept. Next, you have the heritable variation. So the individuals in a population exhibit variation. So each individual has a unique combination of traits, such as size, color, ability to tolerate harsh environments. Some traits improve the chances of an individual's survival and reproductive success, whereas others do not. It is important to remember that the variation necessary for evolution by natural selection must be inherited so that it can be passed to the offspring. So, that particular trait or the character that you would like to pass on to another generation should be uh, inherited by the next generation. So, ano ang pagsabot ano. So, differential reproductive success, individuals that possess the most favorable combination of characteristics, those that make individuals better adapted to their environment, are more likely than others to survive, reproduce, and pass their sexual traits or their traits to the next generation. So, here, sexual reproduction is the key to natural selection. The best adaptive individuals are those that reproduce most successfully, whereas less fit individuals die prematurely or produce fewer or inferior offspring. Okay, so one other premise on which Darwin based his theory of evolution is that individuals transmit traits to the uh, next generation. So kani siya, wala pa na siya ka kuan og genetics ani nga time si Charles Darwin. So, Darwin could not explain how this occurs and why individuals within population vary. Beginning in the 1930s and 40s, biologists combined the principles of genetics. So, you have your Gregor Mendel to thank for this one, with Darwin's theory of natural selection. The resulting unified explanations of evolution is known as your modern synthesis. So, kanang mag-ingon na tag, ang genes nimo kay mapasa sa imong anak. And then, eventually, if this gene continues to become dominant over another gene, then this becomes a specific feature of your offspring, and then evolution could actually occur along the line. Okay? So the modern synthesis explains Darwin's observation of variation among offsprings in terms of mutation or changes in the DNA. Mutations provide the genetic variability on which natural selection acts during evolution. So generally speaking, fossil records, comparative, generally speaking guys, evolution combined with genetics is at sa una, makita lang siya on a macro level, superficial level. Siyempre, upat na akong kamot. Tapos akong mama kay duwara og kamot. So, anang evolution makita sa una. So, it was not, it cannot be explained during the limitations of, let's say, the scientific capability of the people back then. And then, here comes Gregor Mendel doing his pea experiments. Tapos later, makuha na siya kay nadatay genes or DNA and then dictate sa ato ang each part of our characteristics as an organism itself is being dictated by the DNA. So, ana na siya. So, on the basis of support, most of which is beyond the scope of this text, this evidence includes observations from fossil records, comparative anatomy, biogeography, and molecular biology. So if you deal with these particular bodies of science, then you would appreciate evolution more. Okay? And you would somehow believe that evolution is in fact a fact. Okay? and therefore a theory. Okay, a generally accepted fact. Okay, so you have here in molecular biology's um, nucleotide-based differences. So we are somehow closely related to the pig, and then the duck and the rattlesnake are closely related to each other. And then along the line, mas layo si tuna, mas layo si moth, especially mas layo na gyud si yeast. But theoretically speaking, we have our own common ancestors. Kani nga mga points diri kana diri. Okay. Ninyo mga consider mammal ni silang duha. You have birds, and then reptiles, you have fish, then you have insects, and then you have a bacteria or a microorganism, okay, or a fungus yeast. Okay, next we have another way of a community responding to changes over time is what you call succession. So an ecological succession is the process of a community developing over time, which involves species in one stage being replaced by one species. Okay, so ecologists initially thought that succession inevitably led to the stable and persistent community known as your climax community, such as the forest. Meaning, kung kani siya nga area, mahimo ni siyang rainforest, dira ra gyud na sa taman. Rainforest ra gyud siya. Wala sila kabalo sa una nga kani nga rainforest karon could actually be could change into a different biome in the future, perhaps a desert kung grabe na kayong changes. So, mo na ginatawag na climax community. Supposedly nga mo na ni ang pinaka-optimum na type of biome that a particular area can be. Okay? But more recently, this traditional view has fallen out of favor. So the apparent stability of climax forest is probably the result of how long trees live relatively to the human lifespan. It is now recognized that mature climax communities are not in a state of stable equilibrium, but rather in a state of continual disturbance. So meaning, if you see a primary forest karon nga panahon, you cannot actually say that later on it will stay a forest. Okay, even after you die, or even after millions or thousands of hundreds of years, it will stay as a forest, and it could change. Okay, so we have primary succession is the change in species composition over time in a previously uninhabited environment. So meaning, this is primary succession. Wala pa kayo siya tanom, uninhabited, meaning walay plants ug animals. Then later mag-start na o grow ang imuhang lichens, and then followed by mosses, and then to small shrubs. At a later date, it could grow to dwarf trees and shrubs and colonize the area. And then later on, sa later parts of the succession years, it should have spruces and other trees that could grow in that particular area. So primary succession meaning nagsugod siya sa walay vegetation at all, or zero vegetation up to a particular biome. Okay? Ana siya. So ang primary succession. Okay. So, and what is secondary succession? Is the change in species composition that takes place after some disturbance destroys the existing vegetation and soil is already present. So, we have here an example of a secondary succession in an abandoned field in North Carolina. So, first years ni siya after cultivation. So, sa una, let's say, butang pa natin ito. Year 0 after cultivation. So, before cultivation, crops pa ni siya. Mga crops, mga palay, whatever. And then, gi-abandon na siya. So, you will start year 0 year. So, 1 year after the abandonment of this field, nag-start po tubo ang annual weeds or mga grass. Okay, next, you have your perennial weeds, mga daggo-daggo na mga sagbot, basically. Next, 5 to 15 years, you have pine seedlings and saplings, shortleaf pine and loblolly pines. So, mag-start na siya later on, going to mature hardwood forest, which is composed of oaks and hickory trees or plants. Okay, So meaning secondary is from a previously defined terrestrial ecosystem, and then ma-change siya into a different one. Okay, so meaning from an abandoned field or crop field, nahimo siyang forest. Okay, mo na ginatawag na secondary succession. So meaning naa na siya gisundan. Okay, whereas katong primary succession is wala pag wala gyud living organism ani before. Okay, or wala pa available na organic soil kung asa maka-thrive unta ang plants ug animals, and then nagtubo na siya eventually. So ana siya. Okay, so biologists have studied secondary succession and abandonment farmland extensively, although it takes more than 100 years for secondary succession to occur at a single site. A single researcher can study old field succession in its entirety by observing different sites undergoing succession in the same general area. So you do not necessarily need to wait from 0 to 150 years for you to observe this one. So for example, naana siya sa 25 to 50 years, you would actually just look for this particular line. For example, nakay patch of area diri ang abandoned field. So tanaw na nimo connect mo ning heart niya. Mag-observe ka paani nga mga pattern pagawas ka, and then imong tanawon kung nabay changes sa vegetation. Biodiversity survey man siya, or let's say vegetation survey lang. So for example, diri nga initial parts kay mga nag-start na og grow ang mga weeds or annual weeds, and then pasulod ka nag-start na og grow ang imong mga pine seedlings and all. So ana na siya, so maghimo kag let's say transect line that would pierce through the whole abandoned land for you to actually know if naabay level na or naabay separation na of plants. So diri nga portion kay kuan na grass, and then sulod-sulod pa ka kay mahimo na siyang nanaylahi nga mga plants dito, sets of plants. Okay, so these are the two concepts that would describe how populations, either plants or animals, would do if ever changes actually occur in their certain habitats. So meaning it could either that animals evolve or animals will evolve into a more suited structure for it to be able to live in a particular area, or succession na ay changes aning area. So for example, muinit na ang ato ang panahon due to climate change. It's either we evolve mag-evolve ta to become heat resistant, okay, ma-withstand na ato ang warm temperatures, or we go extinct as humans, and then naapoy mag-succeed sa to na succession of different organisms that would now overlap with the human beings. Okay? Balay mo na to katong mga mag-succeed sa to is mga ipis. Patakabalo ba? Sig ipis na po na mag-dominate sa world. Okay? Ma-extinct na ta kay because of climate change. So, ana na siya. So, these are the two concepts that you have to remember when populations actually undergo change in the environment over time. It's either we evolve or we get succeeded by different organisms. Okay? So I hope you get the concept. So we will have to proceed with our next topic next time. Okay? See you guys.